This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Tarkir Dragonstorm, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Sahone, and in this video I'm going to break down the archetypes for Tarkir Dragonstorm Limited. Over the weekend, I looked at every card individually in the set in my set review, and the purpose of this video is to look at the synergies within each wedge and color pair. This set is a little bit different than most in that when it comes to two color combinations, only 5 of them have significant support. The enemy color pairs. That's because each of the enemy color pairs overlap into each of the set's 3 color clans, so most drafts will consist of you starting in one of those color pairs and then getting into a third color, and ultimately ending up in one of the set's 3 color clans. Most decks won't be like evenly divided between 3 colors, but the fixing is good enough in this format that there will be a significant splash of several cards in most decks. Because I'm just looking at synergy, it's not a video where I'll be talking about the straight up best cards in the set like premium removal and bombs and the like. If you want to know more about what cards are just really good, you can check out my set review. Because this set is unusual in terms of how its colors work, I'm going to start with a look at each of the 5 wedges, and especially what their mechanics are, because these mechanics largely dictate what's going on in each of the color pairs, since each enemy color pair has access to 2 clan mechanics. Alright, let's get started with Abzan. So the Abzan mechanic is Endure, which you can see on Fortress Kinguard here. It has Endure 1, which means you put a +1/+1 counter on it, or you create a 1/1 white spirit creature token. So this is a mechanic that can either be about counters or about tokens, and as we're going to see, there is both a counter and a token deck in the format when it comes to the color pairs. Each of the clans also has a couple of signpost uncommons and a signpost common. You can see one of the signpost uncommons here, Armament Dragon, who's very into +1/+1 counters, and the same is true of Reputable Merchant. And both of them do get better if you're also going wide a little bit, because you do need other creatures to put counters on to usually maximize how good they can be, so it all works really well with Endure. So remember that Endure is the Abzan mechanic. It can be about tokens, or it can be about counters. Mardu, meanwhile, has the Mobilize mechanic. This means when a creature attacks, you create X tapped and attacking 1/1 Red Warrior creature tokens, where X is the Mobilize value. So in the case of Bone Cairn Butcher, you make 2 of them, and you sacrifice those tokens at the beginning of the next end step. You can see that the Butcher also gives attacking tokens Death Touch, which works with the Mobilize tokens, but also with the Endure ones that we were just talking about. Reigning Victor is a signpost common here. It also has Mobilize. And one thing to keep in mind with the signpost commons I'm showing you is that you can pay 2 generic for any of those mana symbols. So you could play this card in a Abzan deck, but usually you're going to end up paying 4 total mana for it instead of 3. Now let's look at Sultai, which is about the graveyard as it often is. The Sultai clan mechanic is Renew, which you can see on Keru Goldkeeper here. That means you can pay a cost and exile the card from your graveyard to give one creature in play some counters. And it's not just +1/+1 counters, you can also get keyword counters, as you can see with the Goldkeeper, which puts 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on a creature. Once again, you can see how this can overlap with what we saw in Abzan, which is, the other clan that really overlaps with this one. They only have 1 color different between them. They both share black-green, and both of those clans have counter mechanics, even though they work differently. You can also see Gurmag Nightwatch here, which helps you put cards in the graveyard, and Lie in Wait, which lets you return things from the graveyard for value. So Sultai is about the graveyard and the Renew mechanic. Next, let's look at Jeskai. The Jeskai mechanic is Flurry, which you can see on the Devotee here. That means when you cast your second spell in a turn, something good happens. The Jeskai Devotee gets +1/+1 until end of turn. As usual, Jeskai is pretty into non-creature spells. It does like all spells. Flurry triggers off of any spells. They don't have to be non-creature. But you can also see Jeskai Brushmaster here, which has Prowess, which only triggers off of non-creature spells, and Monastery Messenger, which lets you return non-creature, non-land cards from your graveyard to the top of your library. And lastly, there is Temur. The Temur mechanic is Harmonize, which you can see on Mammoth Bellow here. If a card has Harmonize, it means you can cast it from your graveyard and tap a creature you have in play to reduce the cost of that Harmonize alternate cost by X, where X is the tapped creature's power. And only instants and sorceries, by the way, have Harmonize. So there's a lot of different things going on with Harmonize. It likes things with high power, which is generally the Temur theme more broadly. But it's also a graveyard mechanic, so you can see how that works nicely alongside Renew. And it's also on instants and sorceries, and you can see how that works nicely with what's going on in Jeskai. All right, so those are the 5 clans. I've already hinted at how they overlap with one another, but now we're going to look at each of the 5 2-color combinations that are supported in the set, those being the enemy color pairs, and we're going to see how each of these color pairs works with these guild mechanics we just saw. So, Black-green is a counter deck. Makes sense because this is a color pair where the 2 clan mechanics it has access to are Endure, which can put counters on things, and Renew, which also puts counters on things. You've got 2 signpost uncommons here. One of them is Host of the Hereafter, which enters with counters, and whenever it or any other creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, you can put its counters on up to 1 target creature you control. Importantly, this includes those keyword counters, so you can even move those around with this, and obviously it comes with some built-in counters. There's also Stalwart Successor, a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace that has a very typical +1/+1 counter payoff ability, in that if it's the first time counters have been put on a creature in a turn, you put an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Again, that means if you're even just putting a keyword counter on something, and there are some cards in the set that only put keyword counters on things from the graveyard using Renew, you're still going to get a +1/+1 counter. So both of these work with both +1/+1 counters that are what you'll get from Endure, and the +1/+1 and keyword counters that you'll get from Renew. So let's look at the payoffs for doing counter things. We've already seen Host of the Hereafter and the Successor. There's also Delta Bloodflies, a 2-mana 1/2 flyer that when it attacks, makes your opponent lose 1 life if you control a creature with a counter on it. There's also 100 Battle Veteran, which is a 4-mana 4/2 that gets +2/+4 as long as there are 3 or more different kinds of counters among creatures you control. You can also cast it from the graveyard, and when you do that, it comes back with a Finality counter, which counts as a type of counter, so combined with like 1 keyword counter and 1 +1/+1 counter, there's a reasonable chance that this comes back as a 6/6, and it might just be a 6/6 anyway because there are so many different counters in the set. There's also Yathan Tomb Guard, which whenever a creature you control with a counter on it deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card and you lose 1 life. And there's Formation Breaker, which gets +1/+2 if you control a card with a counter on it. There's Sage of the Fang, which puts a counter on something and has Renew, but its Renew ability is extra geared towards counters because it doubles the number of +1/+1 counters on a creature. Synchronized Charge gives you some counters, and it gives creatures you control with counters Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. Trade Route Envoy is really sweet, one of the stronger commons in the set, as I discussed in my set review, because no matter what it does, you're going to feel pretty good about it. If you've already got a counter around, it's a 4-mana 4/3 that draws you a card, and if you don't have a counter around, well, it gives you one because it puts one on itself. So those are the common and uncommon payoffs for doing counter stuff in Black-Green. And remember, you can overlap from being in just this color pair into being a Sultai deck, where you're probably leaning a little more on Renew in the graveyard, or being an Abzan deck, where you're probably a little more aggressive, because most of the cards you have that make counters can also make creature tokens. And obviously, all the cards with Renew and all the cards with Endure are enablers for these counter payoffs, as are things like the Armament Dragon in Abzan. So, rares that work well here, well, you've got Hollow Merc Siege. It has 2 modes that are great for this color pair, and it is in this color pair, so it's not too surprising. One of them lets you draw a card when a counter is put on a creature you control. It only triggers once a turn, though. And the other mode, the Abzan mode, puts a +1/+1 counter on an attacking creature and gives it Menace until end of turn. One of them is just powerful all on its own. The Abzan mode is going to be really strong, but if you're really going hard on counters, the Sultai mode may draw you a lot of cards. There's also Revival of the Ancestors, the Abzan Saga, so this is one you'll be playing if your 3rd color ends up being white. The 2nd mode lets you put counters on things. There's also Barren Steppe Siege. Again, you'll be playing this if your 3rd color ends up being white. Its 1st mode lets you put counters on all of your stuff at the beginning of your end step. Felithar, again, this is what you'll play if you're in Abzan and not just Black-Green. It lets you sacrifice non-land permanents to put counters on all your creatures. This works nicely with token making and with +1/+1 counter payoffs. There's also Sinkhole Surveyor, just a really strong card that has an Endure trigger every time it attacks. And there's Warden of the Grove, which puts a counter on itself at the beginning of each end step. And anytime a non-token creature you control enters, it endures X, where X is a number of counters on the Warden. So it helps you get more counters, and the more counters that are on it, the more potent it is. So that's Black-Green and Abzan and Sultai more broadly. But this isn't the only direction you can go in one of the enemy colored pairs within Sultai, because there's also blue-green, which is a graveyard deck. So in this color pair, you have access to both Harmonize, a graveyard mechanic, and Renew, a graveyard mechanic. And there are cards in this color pair that reward you for having cards leave your graveyard, as well as the more traditional payoffs for just having cards in your graveyard. We've got 2 signposts and commons here too, of course. One of them is Auroral Procession, which lets you get a card from your graveyard to your hand. And the other is Kishla Skimmer, which anytime a card leaves your graveyard lets you draw a card once per turn. So what are the payoffs for doing graveyard stuff? Well, we've got the Skimmer. There's also Keru Goldkeeper, which we saw earlier. In addition to having a graveyard mechanic itself, and obviously you're going to want cards with Renew in this color pair, it also rewards you for cards leaving your graveyard because it gives you treasure. There's also Aegis Sculptor, which likes it when you have cards in the graveyard because it can exile them to put counters on itself. And so if you also have Kishla Skimmer in play, when you do that, you get to draw. So it's not only about returning cards from your graveyard or exiling them with Renew. They gave you other enablers like the Sculptor here. There's Essence Anchor, an artifact that surveils 1 every upkeep, but you can also tap it and make a zombie token if a card left your graveyard this turn. An Attuned Hunter gets a +1/+1 counter whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard during your turn. Rares that work well here, well, there is Awaken the Honored Dead, a Sultai Saga, which mills stuff, which you're going to want to do for value, and Chapter 3 lets you get something back from the graveyard. Glacierwood Siege I don't think is good as most of the other sieges, mostly because its 2 modes are both just not geared towards limited, because you don't usually play lands from your graveyard. It's not usually that meaningful, even when you're in a mill deck. And milling yourself or your opponent with the other mode also doesn't seem like that meaningful of an effect. But if it works anywhere, obviously it'll be in blue-green. Lotus Light Dancers lets you search up cards to put in your graveyard. And the idea here is that you can grab cards with Harmonize or Renew. Also, you know, if you just need cards in your graveyard to exile to that 2/3 ward flyer that can gain counters, it can just do that for you too. And Songcrafter Mage gives an instant or sorcery card in your graveyard Harmonize until end of turn. So if you go into Teamer, which has one of these graveyard mechanics, you'll be leaning more on Harmonize, and the Mage can help give cards in your graveyard Harmonize. Teyval gives cards in your graveyard Delve. Lacid Prowler can mill a whole bunch of cards because it mills cards equal to the number of lands you control, and it has a powerful Renew ability that puts X +1/+1 counters on a creature, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard. So that's blue-green. It's about the graveyard, and you'll go into one of the third colors, whether you end up in Teamer or Sultai, you're going to be interested in the graveyard because of the clan mechanic you're really leaning into. Next, let's look at black-white. This color pair is all about tokens. That makes sense because the 2 mechanics we've got here are Endure and Mobilize. 2 mechanics that are about making tokens, and so this color pair is about getting value out of them, and Hardened Tactician certainly does that. You can pay 1 generic mana to sack a token and draw a card. That's particularly spicy with Mobilize because those tokens are not long for this world anyway, so giving them up is almost free. And drawing cards off of them is a big deal. And Marshal of the Lost can give an attacking creature +X until end of turn, where X is a number of attacking creatures. So also works well with Mobilize, but just with tokens in general. Payoffs for token things, well, we've got the Tactician and the Marshal. There's also cards like Bearer of Glory, which can buff the whole board, which is going to be good when you're making lots of tokens. Coordinated Maneuver is a solid removal spell that gets better the better you are at going wide. Duty Beyond Death is a spell that has you sacrifice a creature as part of the cost, and that's a lot easier to do if you're in a token deck with lots of Mobilize or Endure than it is otherwise, and then it gives your board a pretty sweet buff. Furious Forebear works pretty nicely with all these different ways to get value out of tokens, particularly sacrificing them, because you can get it back from your graveyard when a creature you control dies, and it's best to give up tokens to trigger that. Salt Road Pack Beast is just an excellent common, but the more creatures you have, the better it gets because it becomes cheaper for each creature you control. Starry-Eyed Skyrider gives attacking tokens you control flying, which is a pretty legit upgrade. Storm Beacon Blade lets you draw cards when you attack with enough creatures. Sun Pearl Kirin lets you bounce things to your hand for value, and one cool addition they gave to that effect here is that if you bounce a token, you can draw a card. So it's sort of like sacrificing a token for value. Similarly, Desperate Measures lets you give a creature +1/-1 until end of turn, and if it dies under your control this turn, you draw 2 cards. So if you have an Endure 1 token in play or a Mobilize token in play, this basically becomes sack a token, draw 2 cards, but it has all these other modes too where you can kill an opposing X1 or otherwise use it on one of your creatures so you can draw cards. There's also Unburied Earthcarver, which can sacrifice the tokens for value. +1/+1 counters in this case. Same thing with Unrooted Ancestor, except it sacrifices them to become indestructible. Venerated Stormsinger likes it when creatures, token or otherwise, die, and it has Mobilize. It lets you drain life anytime a creature dies, so it's particularly good with Mobilize, but again, good with any tokens. Similarly, Worthy Cost lets you sacrifice a token, or any creature, to exile a creature or planeswalker, but obviously that gets way better when you're sacrificing a token. Alright, let's look at rares now, where once again I have Barren Steppe Siege because it lets you put counters on everything, which gets more potent the wider you go, and the Mardu option also works well with tokens, especially if you're leaning more on sacrificing them, because it makes your opponent sacrifice a creature if a creature died under your control during your turn. Felithar, we've already seen, also works really well here. You know, this is a color pair that overlaps both into Abzan and into Mardu. Sacrificing an expendable token and putting a counter on everything is great. Mardu's Siegebreaker lets you exile one of your creatures and make a token copy of it. And with the token upgrades in the format, you know, being able to give that token flying and the like is pretty sweet. Nerev, Heart of the Storm, I have here. He mostly only works with the Mobilize mechanic, but that's fine because he's, you know, the Mardu Spirit Dragon. If you have a lot of Mobilize, it's pretty great because it doubles the damage that is dealt by creatures that have entered the battlefield this turn. We've already seen Revival of the Ancestors. When you're starting out in Black-White, you're going to be most interested in Chapter 1 because it gives you 3 bodies. Thunder of Unity. Its Chapter 2 and 3 mode gets better the more creatures you can put into play, and putting tokens into play is the best way to put multiple creatures into play and thus drain your opponent's life. Windcrag Siege gives you 2 different effects that are good with token stuff. The first one makes it so your triggered abilities of attacking creatures are doubled, so Mobilize is mostly what that buffs. But the Jeskai mode gives you a free token every turn that gets lifelink and haste. Zergo, Thunder's Decree, you know, a Mardu card with Mobilize, but it also makes it so those Mobilize tokens no longer get sacrificed, which is a significant upgrade. Anafenza gives you Endure whenever another non-token creature you control dies. Elspeth Stormslayer, I mean, this is the biggest bomb in the set, but it's going to be particularly gross here because you've got 2 token mechanics ready to really take advantage of her ability to double tokens and to really take advantage of her 0 ability, which puts counters on the whole board and gives them all flying. You're going to be able to abuse that the best if you're going really wide, and you're also going to be able to take most advantage of the tokens she makes if you're already in this deck. Avenger of the Fallen has Mobilize X, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. We've already seen Sinkhole Surveyor. In this deck, you're more likely to want to make the token than you are to put the counter on it. And there's also All Out Assault, which buffs your whole board and gives it Death Touch, which is pretty sweet when we're talking about tokens. All right, let's look now at Red-White. This color pair does have access to 2 clan mechanics, those being the Jeskai mechanic of Flurry, but also the Mardu mechanic of Mobilize. So you can see how this works as an aggro deck. And in particular, this is a deck that wants to trigger things with Flurry that do damage to the opponent or help you build out your board. You can see that on Quarry Mountain Stalwart, which does 2 to your opponent and you gain 2 life when you cast your second spell. And then Frontline Rush is a card that helps you go wide, and it gets better with Mobilize because creatures get +X/+X until end of turn, or the creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So this is a deck that wants to go wide to an extent and also cast multiple spells, and it's most frequently going to cast multiple spells and trigger Flurry by casting lots of cheap creatures and combat tricks and the like. So what are the Flurry cards we have here that work well here? Well, there's Poised Practitioner, which gets a +1/+1 counter when you cast your second spell. There's Rally the Monastery, which is either a combat trick or a way to make some bodies or a removal spell, and it's cheaper if you've cast another spell in the turn. There's Way Speaker Bodyguard, which lets you get some cheap creature or any non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less back from your graveyard, and its Flurry triggers aggressive because it lets you tap an opposing creature. We've got Devoted Duelist, which has a Flurry trigger that pings the opponent. We've got Equilibrium Adept, just a great card that's going to give you a 2-for-1 most of the time because of its Enters ability, but it also has an aggressive Flurry trigger because it gives your Adept double strike. And we've already seen Jeskai Devotee. There's also Reverberating Summons, a card I don't love, mostly because it doesn't do anything a lot of the time. But if you can really consistently trigger Flurry like every turn, the fact that it's a 2-mana 3/3 is going to be pretty great. The rares that work nicely here include, of course, Shiko, should you go all the way into Jeskai. It's just a great card in general, but it will trigger Flurry when you cast it because it lets you exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, copy it, and then cast it. So it's like a one-card Flurry, which is not something there's a lot of in the format. Rediscover the Way is the Jeskai Saga. Chapters 1 and 2 help you draw cards, which is a good way to make sure you keep playing creatures and keep generating Flurry. Chapter 3 is a pretty nice aggressive effect because if you cast a non-creature spell, it is specific about what kind of spell. You give a creature you control double strike. Windcrag Siege is good because it helps you go wide one way or another. Like if you are really leaning more into Mobilize in this deck than you are anything else, you're going to choose Mardu, and the Jeskai mode can just help you go wide. I've got Zurgo here too, just because he's a nice aggressive creature for the deck. Sage of the Skies is one of these double spell payoffs because when you cast it, if it's your second spell, you get 2 copies of it, and that's exactly what this deck's about. Getting 2 creatures for the price of 1 is pretty great. And there's also the equipment Kori Steel Cutter, which gives a nice buff to your creatures to help them attack better, but it has a Flurry ability that generates tokens with prowess. So that is red-white. It's an aggro deck. It has access to both Mobilize and Flurry, and it can go aggressive in one of those 2 ways, whether you lean more into Mardu or lean more into Jeskai. And obviously there's frequently going to be sort of a mix of those things too. It's not like being aggressive with Mobilize doesn't work alongside having like really cheap aggressive creatures. Those things kind of work together. And then our last color pair is blue-red, and it is more of a traditional spell deck. So the 2 mechanics you have access to here are Flurry, which we just saw, and you can sort of see, it's not technically Flurry, but it pays you off for doing the same thing. You can see that Effortless Master here likes to be the second spell you cast in a turn, because it becomes a 4-mana 6/5 with Vigilance and Menace instead of just a 4-mana 4/3. And then Glacial Dragon Hunt has Harmonize, the other mechanic. This is the Teamer mechanic. Like I mentioned when we were looking at Teamer, only instants and sorceries have this ability, so it's a very spell-focused mechanic. And Glacial Dragon Hunt's pretty sweet because it can both help you set up Flurry and have Harmonize itself, because it lets you sift through your library to potentially find more spells, while also being a removal spell. So while red-white was more geared towards triggering Flurry, especially with like creatures and combat tricks, blue-red is a more value-oriented Flurry Harmonize deck, and it leans on Harmonize to some extent to help it trigger Flurry, because if you have Harmonize cards in your graveyard, it gets a lot easier to cast 2 spells in a turn. All right, so what are the common and uncommon payoffs here? Well, you've got Runescale Stormbrood. There's a whole cycle of these Omen dragons that are 2 colors, and they're kind of signpost uncommons as well, but most of them aren't that synergistic with what the color pair's doing. They're just like good cards. This is the exception to that because when it's a creature, it likes it when you cast non-creature spells, which is exactly what this deck wants to do. Meticulous Artisan comes with Prowess. We've got Devoted Duelist again. Well, I do think it's geared more towards the red-white deck because it has a ping trigger. You know, it's not going to be bad in this deck. And Equilibrium Adept is nice for overlapping into both the more aggressive red-white decks and the less aggressive blue-red decks because, you know, it's a card that can get double strike and hit really hard, but it also gives you a 2-for-1, which is exactly what you want. Makes it easier for you to trigger Prowess. You've also got Jeskai Devotee again, as well as Reverberating Summons. I do wonder whether the Summons is actually better in this deck, even though it sort of seems like an aggressive card, mostly because of its second ability, which you can use to reload your hand later in the game. But it's not a card I love either way. We've also got High Spire Bellringer, which makes your second spell each turn cost 1 generic less to cast, which is pretty sweet if you're trying to trigger Flurry. There's also Kishla Trawlers, which when it enters, if you exile a creature from your graveyard, you can return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And there's Wingblade Disciple, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer with a Flurry trigger that makes a 1/1 bird. So what are the rares that work here? Well, again, we've got Shiko and Songcrafter Mage, but there are 2 more that work well here. One of them is Dragonologist, a creature that when it enters lets you reveal an instant, sorcery, or dragon in your top 6 and put it into your hand. This deck is going to have probably the highest density of instants and sorceries of any in the set, so it's most likely to get a hit off of that. And Tygam is a mythic rare with Flurry. He lets you double your spells, but you have to wait for the second copy because it gets suspended. But obviously, it's exactly what you want to be doing in this deck. A deck that sort of grinds out value with spells and flurry more than it tries to just like run the opponent over with flurry creature. So that's the set. Those are each of the 5 3-color wedges, and then each of the color pairs that overlap into those wedges. The set looks pretty fun. I think they did a good job of designing mechanics that work well together for the color pairs that overlap with one another that have clan mechanics from 2 different clans. So it looks to me like decks are going to be pretty synergistic, and it also looks to me like going 3 colors is going to be pretty easy. And again, when I say that, I mean you'll be playing like 3 to 5 cards of whatever your 3rd color is, because you'll be splashing them, and that's way more of a splash than we can manage in most limited formats, right? But it's going to be very doable here, just like it is in most 3-color formats. If you enjoyed this video, found it useful, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including my set review for this entire set, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.